Hey guys, tonight we're stepping softly into ancient Egypt. You're standing beneath a velvet black sky pricked with stars, the air still warm from a sun that seems never to quit. Sand shifts under your sandals, and the faint rush of the Nile makes a background hum, nature's white noise machine. The pyramids loom in the distance, but tonight we won't be climbing those impossible slopes or peeking into cursed tombs. No, tonight we're focusing on something much smaller, much sillier, and, oddly enough, much more human. We're talking about the invention of the very first breath mints. Yes, the people who wrapped their kings in gold and linen also cared deeply about garlic breath. You probably won't survive this desert heat without a water bottle, let alone fit in with the locals, but at least you'll know their secret trick to smelling socially acceptable. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and the time where you're watching, whether it's midnight in Minnesota or early morning in Mumbai. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk slowly along a dusty path that edges the riverbank. The smell of mud and reeds mixes with something spicier, cinnamon perhaps, though it feels out of place in the middle of a marsh. Ancient Egypt is a land of paradoxes. Stone tombs that will outlast empires, and yet daily worries that feel oddly modern. Picture a fisherman hauling in Nile perch. He's sweaty, his teeth not exactly dentist-approved, and when he goes to greet a priest, there's a social hurdle. No one likes the smell of fish breath, not even in 1500 BCE. This is why the Egyptians, masters of perfumes, oils, and incense, also dabbled in little nuggets of sweetness designed to mask the less glamorous realities of human existence. Historians still argue whether these concoctions should be called medicine, candy, or pure social armor. But either way, they tell you something important. Fresh breath mattered. Think about it. These were people obsessed with order, balance, and harmony. They painted their gods in symmetrical poses, aligned pyramids with the stars, and even organized their daily routines around the steady flooding of the Nile. Against that backdrop, bad breath wasn't just a nuisance, it was a disruption of cosmic balance. Imagine leaning in to whisper a prayer to Osiris, only to gag halfway through because your mouth smelled like old onions. Not very sacred. The mainstream fact you can lean on here is simple. Egyptian texts from as early as the Middle Kingdom mention mixtures of honey and herbs for freshening the mouth. That's your evidence of early breath mints. But here's the quirky tidbit. One recipe supposedly included frankincense and cinnamon bound together with honey rolled into small pellets, basically the world's first Tic Tacs, except stickier. And here's your debate phrase for the night. Historians still argue whether these pellets were chewed daily, reserved for ritual, or used mostly as a cure for bad breath linked to stomach ailments. After all, Egyptian medicine liked to blur the lines between what we'd call practical and magical. Picture yourself now inside a modest mud brick home, lanterns flickering, the smell of stewed lentils hanging heavy in the air. A mother kneads dough for tomorrow's bread, her children squabbling over who gets the corner seat near the fire. And on the shelf in the corner, a tiny jar of sticky spheres. They're not snacks for kids, they're carefully rolled breath mints meant for father when he goes to the temple tomorrow. Practical, yes, but also a little ceremonial. You take one, cautiously. It's gritty, uneven, and tastes strange. Sweet, yes, thanks to honey. Spicy too. Cinnamon, if you're lucky enough to afford it, though more often it might be a local herb. And faintly smoky, because resins like frankincense don't exactly dissolve cleanly in your mouth. Modern gum might win on flavor, but these little nuggets were doing their job 4,000 years ago. And here's your first joke tonight. Imagine an ancient Egyptian chewing away awkwardly, trying to impress someone at a banquet when a resin chunk gets stuck between his teeth. Ancient problem? No floss. Modern solution? Still no one carries floss. The Nile drifts by, crocodiles lurking just beneath the surface. Somewhere upriver, traders are bringing cinnamon all the way from South Asia, proof that people will go to extraordinary lengths to not smell like yesterday's dinner. The world is wide, the desert's endless, and yet in the palm of your hand sits a tiny ball of honey and spice, a symbol of how deeply people have always cared about the small comforts. You close your eyes. The scent of incense wafts from a nearby temple, mingling with the minty spice aroma of those ancient pellets. Your breath feels fresher already, though it's probably just your imagination. Still, in the middle of a land obsessed with eternity, it's funny how much detail was lavished on something as fleeting as a single exhale. You're still lingering on the riverbank, but the night has deepened and the stars look sharper now, like someone polished the sky while you weren't looking. As you stroll toward the bustle of a nearby settlement, you start to notice how much emphasis people here place on presentation. Robes pressed as neatly as linen can allow, wigs carefully scented with oils, and, most importantly for our journey tonight, a rather invisible detail, their breath. You might think, really? Breath? Wasn't survival more pressing than smelling nice? But that's exactly where you'd be mistaken. For Egyptians, daily survival and spiritual survival were intertwined. To them, cleanliness and good smells weren't luxuries, they were moral duties, little markers of respect toward others and the gods. Step into a temple precinct and you'll see. Priests wash multiple times a day, shave their entire bodies to maintain ritual purity, and burn incense constantly. You're expected to bring offerings, bow deeply, and yes, speak your prayers. Imagine doing that while reeking of yesterday's onions and beer. Awkward. The mainstream historical fact here, Egyptian etiquette demanded freshness. In fact, in some inscriptions, sweet breath is described as a sign of favor from the gods themselves. It wasn't just about social life, it was practically a divine endorsement. Now, picture yourself wandering into the courtyard of a temple in Thebes. Torches flicker, priests glide about in white linen, and incense coils upward like silk ribbons into the sky. Everyone is speaking softly, reverently, and there you are, edging into the crowd. Someone turns to greet you. You can almost feel the tension because if your breath smells like last night's fish stew, you've ruined the atmosphere. Imagine walking into a yoga class today while holding a bag of fried onions. Same vibe. So you see, fresh breath wasn't just an afterthought, it was a requirement for ritual space, much like removing your shoes before entering certain sacred places today. The Egyptians, with their meticulous obsession for order, what they called ma'at, extended it to their mouths. Harmony had to flow from your words, your gestures, and, apparently, your exhalations. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some records suggest that Egyptians even considered bad breath a symptom of disharmony in the soul. Not just a dental problem, but a cosmic imbalance. So chewing one of those sticky pellets wasn't only about courtesy, it might have been about aligning yourself with the universe. You can laugh, but admit it, you've chewed gum before an odd-job interview, not just to keep from offending, but because it made you feel more put together. Same principle, just a 4,000-year head start. Now, historians still argue whether mints were common among everyday farmers and fishermen, or reserved for elites attending temple rituals and court banquets. Was it something every household whipped up with honey and herbs, or a privilege of those who could afford imported spices like cinnamon? The papyri are frustratingly vague, leaving you to imagine both scenarios. A humble farmer sucking on a honey pellet before talking to the village headman, or a noblewoman casually popping one before dancing at a feast. And speaking of feasts, imagine the spread. Roasted goose, figs, beer brewed thick as porridge, onions piled high, garlic chopped into sauces. Delicious? Absolutely. But breath-wise, a disaster. The banquet hall is echoing with laughter, heart music trickles in from the corner, and everyone is leaning close to whisper juicy gossip about Pharaoh's latest decree. Without mints, the room would smell like a middle school cafeteria after taco day. Here's joke number 1 for this section.
You picture yourself as the lone guest who forgot their breath mint, trying desperately to breathe only through your nose all night. Not exactly graceful. Joke number 2 sneaks in with the priests. Imagine one leaning close to bless you, muttering a sacred formula, only for you to catch a whiff of yesterday's garlic stew. Suddenly, the godly experience feels a little less divine. And joke number 3, fast forward to today, where even with toothpaste and mouthwash, people still keep mints handy before dates. Egyptians just got there first. They basically invented fresh breath insurance. The air in the temple grows heavier with incense, almost sweet enough to choke on. And you realize this was half the trick. Incense masked unpleasant smells everywhere, temples, homes, and tombs alike. But incense alone wasn't enough. That's why they turned to something portable, something you could tuck into a jar or slip into your hand before a meeting with someone important. And so as you wander out of the temple and back into the night, you understand. Breath wasn't just air here. It was life. It was spirit. And it was etiquette rolled into one. Sweeten your words, sweeten your breath. That was the Egyptian way.
The path out of the temple leads you toward a quieter quarter of the city, where workshops huddled together like sleepy neighbors. You duck into one that smells unlike any other, a pungent cocktail of honey, resin, and something you can't quite place. Welcome to the Egyptian apothecary, or perhaps you might call it a kitchen of mysteries, where the earliest breath mints are being born. On the shelves are clay jars with faded markings, bundles of dried herbs tied with reed string, and bowls sticky with half-finished mixtures. You can almost hear the scrape of pestles grinding against stone, the low hum of workers chanting to keep rhythm. Tonight, you're about to meet the ingredients that made Egyptian mouths more tolerable. The mainstream historical fact is this. Surviving medical papyri describe recipes for freshening the mouth using honey mixed with fragrant spices and resins. Honey wasn't just for flavor, it was a preservative, sticky enough to bind everything together into chewable pellets. But here comes the quirky tidbit. One recipe suggests cinnamon, cardamom, and frankincense bound in honey. Sounds delicious, right? Except cinnamon and cardamom weren't local. They came from as far away as South or Southeast Asia, traveling through endless trade routes. In other words, the Egyptians' obsession with fresh breath may have sparked one of the earliest examples of long-distance grocery shopping. Now, historians still argue whether some of the more bizarre ingredients were actually used. Crocodile dung, for instance, shows up in lists of substances for cosmetics and even birth control. Some researchers wonder if it ever slipped into recipes for oral remedies, though others think that's just a scribal confusion. So, no, you're probably safe from dung-flavored Tic Tacs. Probably. Imagine the scene. A young apprentice is tasked with measuring out herbs. He sneezes dramatically as the cinnamon dust tickles his nose, and his teacher scolds him, warning not to waste such precious spice. The boy mutters something under his breath, ironically needing a mint himself. The workshop buzzes with energy. A woman carefully warms honey over a small brazier until it loosens, golden and glossy, before pouring it into a stone mortar. She sprinkles in ground cardamom, adds a lump of frankincense resin, and begins to pound with steady rhythm. The mixture grows fragrant, filling the space with a sweetness that clings to your clothes. And here's your first joke of the night. Imagine this sticky paste ending up not in someone's mouth, but in their hair by accident. Congratulations, you've just invented the world's first accidental candy-scented gel. Now, think about how exotic this all felt in ancient times. Honey wasn't rare, but pairing it with imported spices was a luxury. When you hold one of these finished pellets, you're not just holding a mouth freshener, you're holding proof of a civilization that reached across deserts and seas to satisfy even its smallest comforts.
It's like if someone in your neighborhood imported rare Himalayan mint leaves just for their chewing gum. Second joke. Somewhere, surely, a thrifty Egyptian grumbled, "Why waste precious cinnamon on your mouth when we could burn it for the gods?" Priorities are always up for debate. You step back and notice the jars lining the walls, some labeled with hieratic scrawls too quick for your tired eyes to decipher. Are they recipes, shopping lists, or warnings not to mistake this mixture for face paint? Historians still argue whether the recipes in medical papyri were practical directions for daily use, or more like symbolic charms meant to combine magical properties. The ambiguity leaves you in limbo, unsure whether to swallow or spit. Another scent drifts through the doorway, garlic roasting on an open hearth nearby. You suddenly understand why breath mints were so necessary. In a cuisine dominated by onions, garlic, and fish, people weren't leaving their social impressions to chance. And joke number 3 for this section. Imagine a jealous neighbor spreading rumors, whispering, "Oh, she clearly didn't chew her frankincense ball today." The first example of mint shaming in history. As you leave the workshop, your fingers feel tacky with honey, your nose tingles with spice, and your imagination is wide awake. These odd ingredients, measured and mashed together, reveal something oddly charming. Ancient people wanted the same thing you do before a date or a meeting, that quiet confidence of not breathing last night's dinner into someone else's face. The streets outside are hushed now, torches flickering low, the smell of incense and cooking fires lingering in the air. Somewhere in those clay jars lies the first recipe for sweetness on the breath. And as you stroll away, you can't help but think, it's both strange and soothing that such small details mattered so much, even in a world of pyramids, gods, and empires.
You wander deeper into the workshop district, the sound of pestles and grinding stones echoing faintly through the night. A small doorway beckons you inside, and there you find another group at work. Not farmers or priests this time, but craftsmen who treat every ingredient like it's a sacred offering. The room is warm, filled with the dull thud of tools, and a faint shimmer of candlelight glints off jars of resin. Here, you finally see how those peculiar Egyptian breath mints were actually made. On a broad stone slab lies a neat pile of ingredients: lumps of frankincense resin, small sticks of cinnamon, sprigs of mint-like herbs, and a jar of golden honey that catches the light like captured sunlight. A man kneels with a heavy pestle, grinding spices into fine powder. The motion is slow and deliberate, like kneading dough, and you realize that half the battle was simply patience. The mainstream fact here? Egyptian workshops relied on grinding stones and mortars to break down herbs and resins, often the same tools used for cosmetics and medicines. There wasn't a special breath mint machine, just the timeless pairing of stone and muscle. The quirky tidbit? Some records suggest that frankincense was so tough it needed to be softened with wine or warmed over coals before pounding. You imagine the craftsman sipping a little on the side. Quality control, of course. Historians still argue whether these mixtures were strictly medicinal or whether Egyptians saw them as halfway between food and cure. Some papyri call them remedies for foul breath, while others list them under ritual offerings, suggesting that chewing them may have been a way to honor the gods as well as freshen the mouth. The line between snack and spell was blurry. Watch now as the honey is poured slowly into the stone bowl. It pools thick and sticky, clinging stubbornly to the sides. Powdered cinnamon is sprinkled in, dark flecks vanishing into gold. The craftsman stirs with a wooden stick, then switches to his hands, kneading the mixture like clay. You can almost feel it stretching and tugging at his fingers. Sweet, but resistant, the way modern caramel sticks to your teeth. And here's your first joke. Picture the poor apprentice stuck with the cleanup job, scraping hardened honey off the stone slab at the end of the day. World's first dishwasher and still no tips. The air is heavy with spice. It clings to your clothes, sneaks into your lungs, and makes your stomach growl. But no one's eating these little nuggets just yet. They need to be shaped. A line of apprentices begins rolling the sticky mixture into rough spheres, some large, some small, depending on the batch. They're not uniform like your neatly pressed modern candies. Each one is unique, a bit lopsided, almost charming in its imperfection. Second joke of the night? Imagine buying a bag of these at a marketplace, only to find that half are marble-sized, while the others look like squashed pancakes. Ancient Egyptian fun size, whether you wanted it or not. As the pellets dry on clay trays, you notice how carefully they're handled. They're set in rows, not unlike an army on parade, each ball destined for a mouth, a prayer, or perhaps a noble banquet. The longer they sit, the firmer they become, honey crystallizing just enough to keep them solid. But here's a curious thought. Did people actually chew these, or were they more like lozenges to suck slowly? Historians still argue over this detail, pointing out that resins don't exactly taste delightful when bitten into. Maybe Egyptians simply let the sweetness melt gradually, a slow release of honey and spice, as they whispered their words into sacred halls. Third joke of the night? Imagine someone getting impatient, biting down hard, and suddenly realizing they've just chipped a tooth on a resin chunk. Congratulations, you now need the world's first dentist. The workshop falls quiet as the trays are set aside, the mixture ready to harden overnight. Outside, the desert air cools, carrying the smell of honey and spice into the streets. Children peer in curious, but kept at bay. The pellets aren't for them, not yet. They belong to adults with rituals to uphold and reputations to maintain. You step outside, brushing sticky dust off your hands, and the sound of the Nile drifts back into your ears. Somewhere, in a small jar tucked onto a shelf, lies a batch of fresh breath mints cooling in the night. Tomorrow, they'll be tucked into pouches, carried into temples, and popped discreetly before greetings. And as you walk away, you realize something simple yet oddly profound. No matter how grand the empire, sometimes the real magic lies in the tiny details. The rhythm of grinding stones, the sheen of honey in lamplight, and the quiet care poured into a single ball of sweetness.
The trays of sticky pellets have hardened by morning, and the workshop smells faintly of spice and smoke as the city stirs to life. You drift along the street, following the faint clatter of footsteps and voices, until you find yourself at a courtyard where people sit cross-legged, rolling tiny balls between their palms. The process seems almost meditative, like making bread rolls or prayer beads. This is the next stage, the pill-rolling sessions. Honey and spice mixtures that were ground and kneaded last night are now portioned out, pinched into clumps, and rolled smooth. Each one is laid carefully on reed mats to finish drying under the desert sun. The mainstream historical fact here is straightforward. Egyptians shaped many of their medicinal and cosmetic preparations into pills or pellets, sometimes sealing them in little packets or jars. The habit of rolling medicine into swallowable or chewable balls goes back thousands of years. It wasn't invented by modern pharmacies. And here's the quirky tidbit. Some scholars suggest that the Egyptians deliberately rolled these mints into round shapes to mirror the perfection of the sun disk. After all, roundness carried symbolic weight here. Wholeness, eternity, the cycle of Ra's daily journey across the sky. So, even a humble breath mint might echo cosmic symbolism. Still, historians argue whether these mints were more uniform in elite households or if everyday folks made them haphazardly. Would a queen's mint ball look neat and polished, while a fisherman's looked like a sticky pebble? The evidence is slim, leaving room for you to picture both ends of the spectrum. You watch as an elderly woman rolls hers with almost ceremonial grace, dipping her fingers in water to keep the honey from clinging. A boy beside her struggles, muttering as his misshapen lump sticks to his palm. The laughter that follows feels timeless,
ancient people teasing each other over clumsy handiwork, just as you'd mock a lopsided cookie today. First joke. Imagine biting into one of those misshapen lumps, only to find it glued to the roof of your mouth. No escape until it dissolves. Congratulations, you've invented the world's first caramel disaster. The courtyard hums with chatter as neighbors stop by to collect a handful of pellets for the day. They tuck them into linen pouches, sometimes embroidered, sometimes plain. You notice how casually it happens, like someone today pocketing a stick of gum before heading out. There's no ceremony here, just quiet practicality. Second joke. You picture a harried father rushing out the door, realizing halfway down the street he's forgotten his mint pouch, and groaning, "Great, now everyone will know I had garlic for breakfast." The sun climbs higher, and the mats of drying pellets gleam faintly in the light. Some crack slightly, exposing gritty herbs inside, while others keep their sheen. Children eye them with curiosity, but adults shoo them away. These are not candy, they insist. Still, you can imagine a few kids sneaking a taste when no one's looking. And here's the third joke. One mischievous boy pops a pellet into his mouth, expecting sweetness, only to spit it out seconds later, sputtering at the overpowering resin flavor. Lesson learned: don't steal medicine disguised as candy. As you drift away from the courtyard, you notice the rhythm of life around you. Men haul baskets of fish from the Nile. Women trade onions and leeks at the market. Scribes carry scrolls to the temple. And somewhere in almost every pouch or pocket, a sticky little sphere waits, ready to rescue its owner from culinary regret. The act of rolling, drying, and pocketing these pellets seems simple, but to you it feels like a ritual of care, a way of preparing for the day ahead, like brushing teeth or brewing coffee. It's a moment of pause, a gesture towards social harmony, and a reminder that even empires were built one small sticky ball at a time. The courtyard fades behind you, the sound of rolling hands softening into the hum of daily life. The Nile glitters in the distance, carrying whispers of trade and travel. But for now, you hold in your palm a single honey spice pellet, round, imperfect, and oddly comforting.
The morning sun has now brightened into midday, and you find yourself wandering toward the towering walls of a temple complex. The closer you get, the more you notice that temples aren't just religious spaces. They're also laboratories, clinics, and, in a sense, pharmacies of the ancient world. If you thought your local dentist's office smelled strongly of antiseptic, wait until you step into a room filled with incense, honey, and chalky powders. Inside, priests glide about in spotless white linen, their heads shaved smooth, their bodies washed several times a day in sacred pools. They aren't just spiritual leaders, they're also healers, surgeons, and yes, the closest thing Egyptians had to dentists. It's here you see the curious overlap, a priest chanting prayers while also handing out pellets for bad breath. Imagine your modern dentist reciting hymns while polishing your teeth. The mainstream historical fact is clear. In ancient Egypt, medical practice was closely tied to temple life. Priests studied medical papyri, memorized recipes, and dispensed remedies that blended science and magic. Dentistry was part of this world, with treatments ranging from drilling abscesses to prescribing mouth rinses made of natron and herbs. But here's the quirky tidbit. One ancient papyrus suggests using ground donkey hooves mixed with honey as a dental cure. Whether that was effective or just symbolic, you can only guess, but you probably wouldn't want to test it on your molars. And now the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether priests genuinely understood the medical benefits of their remedies, or whether these treatments were seen mainly as charms backed by divine power. Was honey chosen because it's antibacterial, or because it was considered a sacred food of the gods? Probably both. You pause to watch a priest at work. He leans over a patient who looks distinctly uncomfortable, holding his jaw with one hand and groaning softly.
The priest murmurs a prayer to Thoth, patron of wisdom, while smearing a paste of herbs and honey onto a cloth. The patient bites down, grimacing, while the priest assures him this will sweeten the mouth. You're not sure whether to call it medicine or a placebo, but the act itself carries weight, both spiritual and social. Here comes joke number 1. Imagine sitting in that chair, nervously waiting, only for the priest to tell you, "Don't worry, this might sting a little for the next 3 days." The temple smells rich, incense smoldering, oils warming, a faint tang of natron from the purification baths. To you, it's a blur of sweetness and smoke, but to Egyptians, this was order made tangible. Even bad breath was a kind of disorder, and a pellet of honey and spice could bring harmony back to right. Joke number 2, you think about modern dental drills and suddenly appreciate that, for all the pain, at least your dentist doesn't insist on shaving your entire body before an appointment. The priests keep careful records on scrolls, lists of ingredients, measurements, instructions. Some are practical, others bewildering. Was crocodile dung really prescribed for breath, or did some bored scribe slip in a prank to test his apprentice's patience? Historians still argue, but you can almost imagine a young trainee being dared, "Here, chew this for the gods." Joke number 3, imagine bragging at a banquet, "Yes, I'm blessed with divine favor and donkey hoof toothpaste." Not exactly a conversation starter. But beyond the jokes, you sense the seriousness of it all. To Egyptians, healing wasn't just about curing symptoms. It was about restoring balance, ma'at, between the body, the spirit, and the cosmos. A foul-smelling mouth wasn't just unpleasant. It might indicate decay, imbalance, or even divine displeasure. The priests were guardians of harmony, whether through chants or sticky pellets. As you step out of the temple, the light blinds you for a moment, and the clamor of the city comes rushing back. Children play in the dust, women carry jars of water balanced on their heads, and somewhere in the crowd a man discreetly pops a mint pellet before speaking with a scribe. The temple's quiet gravity lingers, though, the sense that even the smallest remedies carried a sacred echo. You take a slow breath, half expecting it to smell of honey and cinnamon, and smile at the thought. The priests might not have known about bacteria or cavities in the way modern science does, but they knew that sweetness and fragrance could ease discomfort, inspire confidence, and smooth social exchanges. And really, isn't that all most people still want from their dentists today?
Hey guys, tonight we are traveling back 2,000 years to the long, mist-laden courtyards of the Han Dynasty, where your new 9 to 5, actually more like dawn to dusk, is to serve as a librarian for one of the empire's sprawling repositories of bamboo scrolls. Imagine the morning air, cool and damp, heavy with the smell of cypress wood and ink. The stone lions guarding the entrance stare out with their weather-smoothed eyes, completely unimpressed by you and your early morning yawns. You shuffle along the paving stones, robes brushing against your ankles, and the faint sound of cicadas reminds you that even insects were more awake than you. And, of course, you probably wouldn't last 5 minutes at this job, because, unlike modern libraries, the Han collections don't come with comfy chairs, computers, or even the faint hope of coffee. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening right now, I'd love it if you let me know your location and the local time down in the comments. I always find it fascinating to see who's drifting off across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You cross into the courtyard as the sky begins to shift from indigo to pale gray, the air alive with a soft chorus of sparrows. The library complex is larger than you expected, built in perfect symmetry to mirror the emperor's obsession with order.
Rows of roof tiles curve upward at the corners, each one like a frozen wave. You hear the creak of gates as the first attendants arrive, yawning much like you, though with a bit more discipline. They know how serious this work is. After all, this isn't just a place for reading. This is where the memory of the empire is stored, slip by slip. Historians still argue whether the Han government truly intended these libraries to serve the common people, or whether they were mostly showpieces for the court. You, however, aren't debating policy, you're just trying not to trip on your robes while climbing the steps. A senior scribe eyes you with suspicion, as though you've brought the dust of the outside world into this sacred place. And dust, in fact, is enemy number one here. Dust, mold, and the occasional cricket who decided to snack on bamboo fibers. Inside the courtyard, the morning routine unfolds like clockwork. The incense burners are being lit at the entrance. Their thin spirals of smoke drift upward, mixing with the dew and catching shafts of weak sunlight. Someone mutters about how the last storm loosened a few tiles, and if they fall onto the shelves again, the scrolls will be ruined. It's a constant balancing act, preserving thousands of fragile slips in a building never quite dry enough to keep rot away. You walk across flagstones worn smooth by centuries of scholars' feet. One stone in particular dips so deeply it collects rainwater, which becomes a tiny mirror to the heavens. You notice it every morning, but you still catch yourself pausing to see your reflection, a sleepy, underpaid librarian staring back. Well, not exactly paid in silver, more like in grain rations and occasional respect. The empire doesn't value you like it values soldiers or tax collectors, but here you are, shouldering the weight of knowledge itself. A faint clang echoes from somewhere beyond the wall. That would be the bell that signals dawn's official arrival. You were expected to be inside before it tolls a second time, or else your supervisor, whose eyebrows alone could cut bamboo, will write your name into a ledger you very much don't want to appear in. You hurry past the guardian lions, noting the way their stone teeth glisten with dew, as if they had just finished an early morning breakfast of careless apprentices. As you push open the heavy wooden doors, the smell hits you first. Ink, dust, and cedar shelves, mingling into a fragrance both musty and oddly soothing. It's like the smell of old books in a modern library, only sharper, as though the bamboo itself is whispering. The scrolls are locked away for now. Your task in this first hour is not glamorous. You sweep the courtyard walkway with a straw broom, then wipe condensation off the entry tables. Yes, you studied for years to learn how to read complex characters, and yet here you are, starting your day with janitorial chores. Scholars may argue about Confucian ethics, but dust does not sweep itself. And speaking of Confucius, you can almost imagine him shaking his head at you. He would probably say, "Do not complain about menial tasks," or at least, "do not complain so loudly." One of your fellow librarians cracks a joke about how Confucius never had to mop water off scroll racks. Everyone chuckles softly. It's the only humor allowed before tea. The light grows stronger. You adjust your robes, tie your hair with a strip of cloth, and prepare to face the day's endless scrolls. A sparrow hops inside the entryway, pecks at a stray grain of rice, and then decides this is not the place for birds after all. Lucky creature, you think, as it escapes into the sky. The empire beyond these walls is buzzing with merchants, soldiers, and farmers. But here, inside this courtyard, time feels slower, more deliberate. Each step you take echoes as if carved into the record of history itself. It's only the first hour of your shift, and already your feet ache. But that's what it means to be a librarian of the Han. You are not just caring for scrolls, you're caring for civilization's memory.
And that responsibility, heavy though it feels, wraps around you like the morning mist.
The doors groan as you slide them open, revealing rows of dark chambers where the scrolls sleep in their lacquered chests. These are not rooms you can just wander into casually. Each one is sealed with knots tied in silk cords because a slip of bamboo might be worth more than a chest of coins. You shuffle in, brushing past the cool stone walls, and the air changes immediately. Drier, colder, and carrying the faint metallic tang of ink mixed with cedar oil. You reach for a bronze key ring that jingles softly like wind chimes. Each key belongs to a different chest, and no one is foolish enough to forget which is which. Your supervisor once told you that opening the wrong storeroom was like mixing up a royal decree with a recipe for fish sauce. Embarrassing and possibly career-ending. So you pause, squinting at the scratched characters on the tags before selecting the right one. Historians still argue whether these collections were ever fully catalogued, or whether the sheer volume of bamboo slips made complete order impossible. Judging by the mountain of chests before you, you're inclined to believe the latter. Every chest contains thousands of slips, tied in bundles, each bundle whispering of farming records, poems, legal codes, or medical recipes. One wrong shuffle, and you'd spend the afternoon untangling history like a very boring knot. The first storeroom clicks open, and you're greeted with the scent of old smoke, traces of the fires used to harden the bamboo centuries ago. You carefully lift the lid, and there they are. Endless strips of bamboo, bound in cords, lying flat like soldiers on parade. Each strip is no thicker than a finger, carved with tight, neat characters that curve slightly where the knife pressed too hard. You pick one up, feel its smoothness, and marvel that this tiny sliver holds laws powerful enough to determine life or death. Of course, that gravitas fades quickly when you notice the mildew creeping in at the corners. Librarians spend half their lives waging war on mold. Goose feather dusters, sunlight carefully angled through windows, cedar shavings packed between the chests. Yet still the spores return, stubborn as tax collectors. You mutter a complaint, though quietly, since your voice echoes through the room like an accidental gong. One of your colleagues, already inside, is kneeling before another chest, muttering curses at a bundle whose silk cord has frayed. He looks up, sighs and jokes that if the empire collapses, it will be because a slip about chicken-raising schedules disintegrated before anyone copied it. You laugh, but softly. Joking about collapse is the kind of humor best confined to locked rooms. The morning sun filters through a tiny window cut high in the wall, painting a strip of gold across the floor. Dust motes dance in the beam like drunken scholars at a festival. You take a moment to watch them, allowing your mind to wander. What if one day, centuries from now, people stare at fragments of your handwriting and debate whether you really knew what you were doing? The thought is equal parts amusing and horrifying. And speaking of handwriting, you can't help but recall the time last month when a junior scribe accidentally inked a scroll upside down. For days afterwards, everyone teased him, saying he was pioneering a new school of inverted Confucianism. He didn't laugh, but you still smile whenever the memory sneaks back in. You continue opening the chests one by one. The cords are stiff, sometimes sticky with resin. Your fingers ache from tugging, but the ritual has a rhythm that's almost meditative. Pull cord, lift lid, check for pests, check for dampness, close lid, move on. Over and over until your body forgets it's even working. Perhaps that's why librarians last so long at this job. The monotony itself is strangely soothing. And yet, every so often, you stumble upon something unexpected. Today,
It's a bundle labeled with characters you don't immediately recognize. You set it aside, making a mental note to ask a senior colleague. For all you know, it could be an obscure military manual or just someone's shopping list for more incense. Scholars still debate how many lost classics were hidden away in collections like these, never studied because no one recognized them in time. You sigh, because the idea that history might slip through your fingers while you dust shelves feels unfairly poetic. The floor creaks as you move deeper into the chamber. In the far corner, you hear a tiny scuttling noise. Mouse. You freeze, heart skipping, then see it dart across a gap in the wall. You breathe again, though you know you'll need to report it. The last thing anyone wants is a rodent gnawing through military treaties. Imagine the empire falling because of a mouse with a taste for strategy. You chuckle to yourself, quickly shushing your own laughter. By now, the incense from the courtyard has reached even here, thin tendrils curling into the shadows. The scent reminds you it's almost time for tea, but not yet. For now, you finish unlocking the remaining storerooms, every turn of the key echoing like a soft drum beat against the stone. When the last lid closes, you rub your stiff fingers together, ink-stained and sore. The rooms are open, the scrolls safe, and the day's great unraveling of words can finally begin. You step back into the hallway, blinking against the sudden brightness. Your robes smell faintly of cedar, dust, and just a hint of mildew. You have only completed the morning's first task, yet already your shoulders feel the weight of an empire's paper trail.
You can almost feel your stomach protesting by now. But before you even think about food, there's the matter of ritual. No one begins the real work of cataloging the copying until the incense and tea have been properly arranged. You shuffle toward the small side rooms set aside for this purpose, a space both sacred and slightly cluttered, smelling of ash, damp wood, and something faintly bitter that clings to your robes long after you leave. The tea chest sits in the corner, packed with rough leaves that look more like shredded twigs than the delicate curls you buy in a modern shop. You scoop a handful into a clay pot, splash in water that's only halfway to boiling, and watch the pale green swirl rise like morning fog. It doesn't taste wonderful, more like grass steeped too long in a puddle, but it does the job. Your eyelids lift just a little, enough to remind you that you are still alive. Someone once joked that Han librarians weren't kept awake by tea so much as terrified into consciousness by its bitterness. You sip, wince, and silently agree. Historians still argue whether tea at this stage of Chinese history was meant more for ritual purity or for flavor. Judging by your puckered mouth, you're leaning toward ritual purity. No sane person would drink this willingly for enjoyment, unless enjoyment meant bragging later about how strong your stomach is. Across the room, a senior scribe is arranging sticks of incense into a bronze burner shaped like a crouching tiger. The first spark of flame crackles, then soft smoke begins curling upward, thin as silk thread. You're expected to bow slightly, nothing dramatic, just a little acknowledgement that the day's labor deserves its blessing. So you bow, even though in your mind you're already dreading the bamboo slips waiting for repair. The incense fills the air with a resinous scent, pine and sandalwood mixed with something harder to place. You cough softly, not loud enough to attract attention, but enough to remind yourself that sacred smoke is still smoke. The old superstition says it drives away pests that might harm the scrolls. Whether that's true or not, you'll take any excuse for fewer mice. Remember that scuttling visitor from earlier? You find yourself muttering, half to the smoke itself, "Keep the mice away, please." One of your colleagues joins you, carrying his own steaming cup. He sits, stretches his legs out rudely far, and sighs like a man being crushed by the weight of eternity. Then, with complete seriousness, he remarks that the tea tastes exactly like boiled boots. You snort into your cup, almost spilling it. He grins, satisfied to have earned the first laugh of the morning. 3 jokes in, and it's not even noon. You silently declare him a dangerous man. The ritual isn't all humor, though. There's a moment where everyone settles into silence, holding their cups, listening to the faint hiss of incense burning down. You feel your shoulders drop, your breath deepen, and the whole building seems to exhale with you. Outside, sparrows are still chattering, but in here, time stretches long and smooth. You're reminded suddenly of a fringe story you once heard, that during the reign of Emperor Wu, a librarian accidentally spilled tea over a bundle of scrolls, staining them permanently. Instead of punishment, he supposedly declared it an experiment in preservation, claiming the tannins would protect the bamboo. No one could prove him wrong, and the tea-soaked scrolls were shelved like all the others. Whether that's true or not, you make a mental note to keep your cup far, far away from today's work. Another sip, the bitterness doesn't soften, but your mind begins to sharpen. The faint pounding in your temples eases. Your colleague mutters about how he'd prefer wine. You quietly agree, but add that wine would only make the characters blurred together. He grumbles that maybe blurred characters would look prettier than half the calligraphy you'll see today. You chuckle, quietly enough to keep the ritual's dignity intact. When the last of the incense stick crumbles into ash, the ritual is done. No announcement, no ceremony, just the quiet acknowledgement that now the day can officially begin. You set your empty cup aside, the clay still warm against your palm, and step back into the hallway. The smoky fragrance clings to your sleeves, following you like a loyal but slightly suffocating friend. The rooms ahead are filled with unread scrolls, cracked slips, and the quiet sighs of librarians resigned to their fates. You take one last deep breath of the incense-thick air, knowing that from here it's all ink stains and sore wrists. But for just this moment, with tea bitterness still on your tongue, you feel strangely awake, strangely steady, as though you could actually make it through the mountain of bamboo waiting for you.
The dust is back. It's always back. You sigh, grabbing the long-handled goose feather duster that looks more like a carnival prop than a tool of scholarship. Its white plumes tremble in the air, soft enough to tickle but firm enough to scatter layers of stubborn gray from the bamboo slips. You shake it gently over the shelves, and the dust swirls into golden beams of sunlight like tiny ghosts rising reluctantly from their graves. The trick is to move slowly. Otherwise, the dust floats right back onto the same spot, undoing your effort. You pace the aisles, feathering each chest, muttering as you go. This is not glamorous work, and yet it matters. Dust is a librarian's eternal enemy. Left unchecked, it invites mold. And mold, as you know, doesn't just ruin one scroll, it spreads like gossip in the marketplace. Historians still argue whether ancient custodians truly understood the microscopic causes of decay, or if they relied mostly on rituals and incense to banish the rot. What is clear is that they waged a daily battle with it, armed with feather dusters, cedar oil, and endless patience. You add your name to that long roster of reluctant warriors. You pause when you notice a faint nibble at the edge of one slip. Not mold, teeth marks. The mice have been at it again. You grumble, half amused, half horrified, imagining a rodent proudly reciting Confucian sayings after a midnight snack. You joke to yourself that if the mice ever develop literacy, you'll simply hand them the duster and retire. Nearby, a colleague sneezes loudly, sending another puff of dust into the air. You glare at him. He shrugs. This is the librarian's circle of life. Sneeze, dust, repeat. It's strangely comforting in its inevitability. You wipe your sleeve across your face and return to feathering, even slower now, savoring the hypnotic rhythm of the motion. The shelves creak as you shift bundles, sliding one aside to dust the surface beneath. Some cords fray as you lift them, silk giving way to time. You hum softly while working, the way you always do when your arms begin to tire. The tune isn't much, just a string of notes that sound like a lullaby sung through a yawn. But here, in this quiet chamber, it feels like the shelves themselves are humming back.
And then you remember that peculiar tidbit. Some early libraries supposedly employed cats to deal with pests. Imagine that. Fat, dignified felines patrolling these aisles like furry supervisors. You grin, picturing a stern tabby seated at the catalog desk, pawing at misfiled slips. Whether that story is true or not, you'd welcome the help. Goose feathers do not hiss at mice. The sunlight shifts higher, making the dust sparkle like tiny stars before fading back into dullness. Your duster strokes grow slower, lazier. There's a strange peace in this repetition, as though you're erasing time itself from the shelves. Every bundle you brush clean seems to breathe easier, waiting quietly for the next hand to reach for it. By the time you finish, your arms ache, and your nose tingles with the residue of 100 tiny particles. But the shelves gleam, at least for now. Tomorrow they'll gather dust again, but that's tomorrow's problem. You rest the goose feather duster back in its stand, feathers fluffed and proud, like it knows it has earned a small victory. The mice may return, the mold may creep back, but for one shining hour, the library is fresh, calm, and ready. You stretch, yawn, and smile faintly, content with this small, quiet triumph.
The silence breaks with the shuffle of sandals and the low murmur of voices. Visitors have arrived. Couriers from the imperial court, their robes stiff with travel dust, their faces set in that look of polite urgency that says, "We have orders and you must obey them, no matter how inconvenient." You glance at your colleagues. Everyone exhales the same invisible sigh. The lead courier produces a bamboo tally, the official marker of authority, and announces his request. Military treatises, obscure volume, third chest of the western storeroom. His tone implies he knows exactly what he's asking for, but you've been here long enough to recognize the truth. He barely knows what's inside these walls. To him, the scrolls are interchangeable bundles of bamboo. To you, they're a maze. You shuffle off toward the storeroom, trying to recall where you last saw the requested title. Was it under the section on siege ladders or buried next to agricultural reports? Historians still argue whether the Han classification system was brilliantly logical or hopelessly confusing. Standing in front of rows of nearly identical bundles, you lean toward the latter. The courier follows close behind, peering over your shoulder as though suspicion alone will conjure the scroll faster. You mutter, more to yourself than to him, "If the Empire depends on me finding this within the next hour, we're all in trouble." He doesn't laugh. Couriers rarely do. You rummage through chest after chest, fingers tracing chords, lips mumbling titles. At last, tucked between two unrelated works, astrological charts on one side, farming tax reports on the other, you find it. A slim bundle with characters so faded you wonder if anyone has opened it since your grandfather's time. The courier snatches it eagerly, bows, and vanishes as quickly as he arrived. No thank you, no acknowledgement of the dust still clinging to your sleeves. Another visitor steps forward. This one is less impatient, a scholar from the provinces with ink stains on his fingers and excitement in his eyes. He requests a commentary on music, some obscure section on how zithers were tuned 2 centuries ago. You raise an eyebrow, half amused. Out of all the knowledge in this building, he wants that. Still, you lead him to the shelf, dig through another chest, and hand over the bundle. He bows deeply, grateful, before shuffling off to the reading room. You can't help but like him better than the courier. And then comes the strangest request of the morning. A minor clerk insists he needs a scroll on dream interpretation, claiming it's crucial for the Emperor's astrologers. You stifle a laugh. Imagine the fate of the Empire hinging on whether someone dreamt of 3 geese instead of 4. Still, you find the scroll, its edges ragged, its text filled with cryptic notes. You pass it over, wondering silently if the stars themselves are rolling their eyes.
These moments remind you that the library is not just a tomb for old words. It's alive, constantly pulled and prodded by the needs of officials, scholars, and the occasional superstitious. You are the silent hinge that connects them all, and though it can be tedious, there's a secret satisfaction in being the one person who knows exactly which dusty chest holds the answer to a question no one else can solve. The visitors leave one by one, scrolls clutched to their chests. The courtyard quiets again, though the air still hums with the faint echo of their footsteps. You return to your mat, rubbing your temples. Your day is only half done, and you already feel like you've carried the empire on your shoulders, hidden not in swords or coins, but in words inked onto bamboo. The inkstones are lined up like soldiers, black and squat, waiting for the day's first drops of water. You kneel at the low table, set out your brushes, and already your fingers twitch with the memory of yesterday's work. Copying is not glamorous. It's not even particularly comfortable, but it is the heart of your life here. And without it, the empire's memory would fade faster than dew on the tiles outside.
Hey guys, tonight we slip into a place that feels impossibly far from your glowing phone screen, yet here you are, wandering down the bustling avenues of Ming-era Beijing. You're not sprinting or dodging traffic, though. This isn't a modern city with honking cars and impatient cyclists. No, you're trudging slowly, shoulder to shoulder with merchants who smell faintly of sesame oil, scholars with long sleeves brushing the dust, and donkeys that really don't care where their droppings land. The first thing that strikes you is scale. The walls, the gates, the rooftops, they stretch so far and so wide that your sense of direction fizzles out. You feel tiny in the shadow of stone watchtowers and vermilion gates, as if the city has been designed to remind you you are not the important one here. A gentle reality check for you. If you actually had to live in this place with its smoky air and questionable water supply, you probably wouldn't last more than a week. Still, as a cozy time traveler tonight, you're safe to gawk and shuffle along. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and the local time down in the comments. I love seeing where and when people are drifting off. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The streets aren't just thoroughfares, they're stages. Picture a sedan chair gliding by, curtains drawn. Inside might be an official, or maybe just someone who paid for the ride to avoid the mud. Kids chase each other with sticks, the clack of wooden sandals echoes, and a group of soldiers march past, trying their hardest to look intimidating while secretly hoping no one notices their slightly crooked helmets. The Ming capital is Beijing, a city transformed into the imperial hub after Emperor Yongle decided to uproot everything and move it here in the early 1400s. That decision wasn't just about architecture, it was a statement. Stone by stone, the city became a living announcement of power. Historians still argue whether Yongle moved the capital primarily for strategic defense against Mongols or simply because he loved the idea of a grand new center. Either way, you're now standing inside his imperial dream, inhaling the mingling aromas of fried dough and horse sweat. A mainstream historical fact to ground you: the Ming capital's population likely swelled past 1 million residents, making it one of the largest cities in the world at the time. Imagine every alley humming, every market buzzing, every courtyard packed with people navigating this monumental hub. And here you are, pressing your way through, overhearing snippets of gossip you don't quite understand, since everyone seems to be speaking in clipped Beijing dialect. But let's add a quirky tidbit. Stray dogs in the city sometimes wore little bells, not as pets, but as makeshift burglar alarms.
Families would keep them near doorways, and when the dogs stirred, so did the household. You pass one now, a scrappy mutt wagging its tail, jingling faintly like a sleepy tambourine. Somehow it feels more charming than threatening. You glance upward, and the skyline isn't modern glass and steel, but tiled roofs that curve like frozen waves. Watchtowers punctuate the walls. A passing monk clutches a prayer bead necklace longer than your arm. You trail behind him, listening to the faint clack of each bead against the next, a rhythm both calming and oddly hypnotic. Everywhere you look, you see movement towards something grander. The city feels like it's funneling you inward, drawing you closer to that great looming forbidden city. It squats behind high crimson walls, daring you to peek inside. You don't get there yet, though. Tonight is about moving slowly, savoring the textures, like when you pause at a stall selling candied hawthorn skewers, glossy, sticky red fruits lined up neatly on a stick. You can't help but imagining licking the syrup, which immediately makes your teeth ache, but it's probably the perfect treat if you don't mind losing a filling or two. What keeps you drifting forward, besides curiosity, is the rhythm of the watch drums. In the Ming capital, time is literally sounded out for you. Gongs, clappers, and drums mark hours, quarters, and the important transitions of day and night. Right now, you catch the low, resonant beat of a drum tower in the distance, guiding you like a sleepy metronome. A scholarly debate lingers in the air, almost as thick as the wood smoke. Some historians still argue whether Ming Beijing was more cosmopolitan than contemporaneous cities like Istanbul or Delhi, or if its grandeur masked a somewhat rigid, inward-looking bureaucracy. For you, the traveler, those debates dissolve into the sheer sensory overload of the present moment. You can feel the grit on your sandals, the tickle of dust in your throat, and the press of humanity all around. And then there are the animals. Horses clip-clop steadily, cows lumber reluctantly, and somewhere in the distance you hear a goose honking with surprising authority. Maybe it's scolding you personally. You can't tell. The Ming capital has room for everyone, even sarcastic poultry. You shuffle further along a market lane, brushing past bolts of silk dyed in shades that make modern paint catalogs look boring. A man with a fan painted with mountains waves it lazily, more for style than temperature control. Another merchant sells little packets of incense, each promising to mask the smells of city life with lotus or sandalwood. You can't help but thinking of them as Ming-era air fresheners, the equivalent of those pine-shaped things dangling from rearview mirrors today. The deeper you go, the more the city feels alive with whispered rules. Don't walk too close to a procession. Don't stare too long at someone above your station. Don't accidentally trip over an official's robe. And yet, amid the caution, there's laughter. Children giggling as they splash through puddles, women bartering with playful jabs, and an old storyteller who raises his voice just loud enough for you to hear the tale of a tiger that once prowled near the outskirts of the city. You catch only fragments, but the exaggerated gestures do half the work. The sun dips lower, brushing the rooftops with gold, and shadows stretch long. The city doesn't slow down, it hums, ever restless, like a hive of bees that somehow managed to invent bureaucracy. And you, an accidental time tourist, keep drifting, hypnotized by the rhythm of footsteps, voices, bells, and drums.
You follow the pull of the crowd until, before you quite realize it, the great red walls of the Forbidden City rise like a horizon in front of you. They're smooth, tall, and just a little intimidating. The sort of walls that remind you that someone very important and very guarded lives behind them. The Meridian Gate towers above, its 5 arches standing like silent bouncers. You slip along with a stream of officials, their embroidered robes whispering authority as they pass. Inside, the pace changes. Outside the walls was chaos, hawkers, animals, dust. But here, the air feels almost rehearsed. The courtyards stretch so wide that you could lose yourself just crossing them. Stone tiles radiate the day's heat back at your sandals, and you're already regretting not bringing water. Ming architects weren't designing for comfort.
They were designing for awe, and you, small and sweaty, are duly awed. Everywhere you turn, bureaucracy breathes. Clerks shuffle thick bundles of bamboo-bound documents, scribes sharpen brushes over tiny porcelain inkwells, and runners dart from one hall to another like ants carrying crumbs. If you thought modern office life was soul-crushing, try doing it in embroidered silk under the gaze of stone-faced officials. There's a reason Ming records are so exhaustive. Someone's cramped hand wrote down nearly everything. A mainstream fact anchors this image. The Ming government had 6 main ministries: personnel, revenue, rights, war, justice, and works. Each one had to coordinate with the emperor and with each other, a recipe for endless paperwork. You imagine one unfortunate scribe copying the same decree 20 times while sighing audibly enough to earn a side-eye from his supervisor. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some clerks used ink mixed with glue to make their writing shinier and more impressive. It probably looked fancy at first, but when the humidity rose, the glue could warp the paper. So you might spend hours drafting a memorial to the emperor for it to buckle into something resembling a toddler's art project. Not exactly career-enhancing. You notice a row of officials lined up for an audience. Each one holds a tablet of polished wood, like an ancient clipboard, on which petitions or notes are written. Their hats tilt slightly forward, flat as serving trays. A breeze stirs, and you picture those hats catching wind like kites, though no one dares laugh at the sight, at least not openly. Historians still argue whether the Ming bureaucracy functioned as a smoothly oiled machine or as an elaborate theater of formality. On one hand, the state managed taxes, armies, and grand construction projects. On the other, layers upon layers of reports meant decisions sometimes took months to trickle upward. You can almost hear an impatient official muttering, "By the time this reaches the emperor, my grandson will be retired." Your path leads through a side hall, where junior clerks hunch over desks. They grind ink sticks slowly on stone slabs, the rhythm steady, hypnotic, almost meditative. The air smells of soot and pine resin. Occasionally a supervisor walks by, his long sleeves swishing dramatically, peering at the neatness of each character. It's the original quality control department, minus ergonomic chairs. Imagine your modern office printer jamming. Now imagine your entire job depends on hand copying a 20-page edict without smudging a single brushstroke. That's the daily tension here. You lean over one clerk's shoulder and see him pause for a long sigh before carefully brushing the final stroke of the word for tax. The brush bristles fan slightly, threatening to blot, but he pulls it off, barely. The relief on his face is something universal, the same joy as hitting send without autocorrect changing your message into nonsense. Beyond the clerks, the halls grow grander. You step into the Hall of Supreme Harmony, where the emperor himself might appear. The throne sits high, framed by dragons curling in golden swirls. Today, though, no emperor, just rows of attendants rehearsing their bows, perfecting angles that would make a yoga instructor jealous. You can almost hear the unspoken rule: bow too shallow and it's disrespectful, bow too deep and you look ridiculous. One odd ritual catches your eye. Some officials carry their petitions in silk pouches embroidered with personal motifs: clouds, cranes, waves. It's the equivalent of customizing your email signature with inspirational quotes, except here it might signal family prestige or scholarly aspiration. You stifle a laugh as one particularly serious man clutches a pouch covered in turtles. Maybe he's hoping for longevity in his career, or maybe he just really likes turtles. From the far side of the courtyard, a runner scurries by with a tray of teapots, the porcelain rattling like a nervous tambourine. You realize that bureaucracy, for all its grandeur, runs on 2 essentials: tea and more tea. Without it, half the ministries would probably nap through the emperor's decrees. The pace of this world is oddly soothing for you. No one's rushing to meet a deadline in the modern sense. Instead, everything unfolds with ceremony, as if time itself has to pass through layers of brush and seal before moving forward. Even the act of sealing documents is a performance. Red wax, heavy stamps, the thump of authority pressed into paper. You find yourself drifting along with the rhythm, lulled by the repetitive scratch of brushes, the measured footsteps, and the echo of drums faintly outside the walls. Somewhere nearby, an official clears his throat with exaggerated dignity, as though preparing to recite something world-shaking. But when he finally speaks, it's just a reminder about the allocation of firewood. Bureaucracy Ming style. By the time you step back into the sunlight of another vast courtyard, you realize hours could pass here without anything dramatic happening. And yet, in the quiet repetition, there is a strange comfort. The empire keeps humming forward on ink, paper, and patience. You might not survive the humidity or the workload, but for now, as a drowsy guest, you're content to watch the scrolls pile higher.
You drift deeper into the palace, where the atmosphere shifts again. The courtyards of bustling clerks fade behind you, and now you find yourself among hushed corridors draped with latticed screens and silken curtains. The air feels heavier, not because of dust, but because of secrets. This is the domain of the eunuchs, the curious and powerful figures who stand in that liminal space between servants and shadow rulers. They move quietly, their embroidered slippers brushing stone, their long robes gliding without a wrinkle. Some carry ledgers, others keys, and a few simply stand motionless, like statues that occasionally blink. You can tell right away, these are not men you'd want to accidentally spill tea on. The role of eunuchs in Ming politics is one of history's enduring puzzles. Mainstream fact first. Eunuchs served as personal attendants to the emperor and his household, managing access to the inner court. They weren't just minor servants. At their height, they wielded power over finances, military logistics, and even foreign diplomacy. Some became so influential that they rivaled the authority of top ministers. You picture yourself trailing one now. He carries a stack of scrolls bound in crimson ribbon. Each step is measured, as though he knows someone's always watching. You half expect him to turn around and say, "Why are you following me?" But instead he just slides through another carved doorway, disappearing into the web of chambers. Here's the quirky tidbit. Eunuchs often developed secret codes and signals among themselves. Some historians suggest they had hand gestures or subtle ways of passing information, like a raised eyebrow or a folded sleeve. You pause by a corner and swear you just saw two of them exchange the kind of look that says, "Meet me by the incense burner. I've got news." You lean in, pretending to study the wall painting of a dragon, while your ears perk up at the faintest whispers. Historians still argue whether the eunuchs truly protected the emperor's interests, or whether they manipulated him for their own gain. To you, walking these hallways, it feels like both could be true at once. They are guardians, yes, but also gatekeepers, filtering who gets close to the throne. It's the original version of who's in the group chat and who's left out. The deeper you wander, the stranger the details. Rooms are lined with cabinets filled with ledgers, grain inventories, silk rolls, tax receipts, even lists of palace lanterns. Somewhere in that mess, eunuchs kept a running account of how many chickens were consumed in a month. You peek over one ledger, pages upon pages of chickens, tallied neatly. It's bureaucracy blended with poultry obsession. And yet the eunuchs weren't just clerks. They often became patrons of the arts, collectors of curiosities, even explorers of strange technologies. Some kept private gardens where they raised rare plants, or sponsored theatrical troupes to perform behind closed walls. Imagine binge-watching your favorite show, but instead of Netflix, it's a traveling opera company you personally bankroll. One eunuch glides past carrying a tray of tiny porcelain cups, steam curling upward. You can almost smell the earthy tea leaves. Another adjusts a lantern, tilting it just enough to cast a softer glow on the mural of cranes overhead. Their world is one of details, every curtain folded precisely, every mat aligned to perfection. It makes you oddly self-conscious about your own socks back home, probably mismatched again. The palace corridors are a labyrinth, and you soon realize that's the point. They're designed so never outsiders know where they truly are. You catch faint echoes of music, plucked strings and low flutes, but when you follow, the sound vanishes, replaced by murmured conversations and the rustle of robes. There's a tale you overhear, whispered by two attendants. They speak of a eunuch who once rose so high that he commanded fleets, issuing orders to generals. Some believe these powerful figures steered the empire's destiny more than emperors themselves. Others dismiss it as rumor inflated over centuries. Either way, you can feel the weight of their presence, like shadows clinging to the edges of every carved pillar. You pause at a doorway framed with dragons, peering into a chamber filled with scroll racks. A young eunuch carefully unrolls a decree, his lips moving silently as he rehearses its contents. The brushwork glistens with red ink, the emperor's seal stamped at the bottom like a fiery sun. The eunuch rolls it back up, tucks it under his arm, and vanishes into the night's shadows. For you, a drowsy traveler, it's almost lulling. The constant shuffling of slippers, the faint echoes of whispers, the occasional clink of porcelain, everything blurs into a rhythm. You could fall asleep right here against a cold stone column, dreaming of embroidered robes and sealed scrolls. But the corridor pulls you onward, as though it promises there's always another secret around the next bend. And somewhere, in the distance, beyond even the eunuch's reach, lies the throne itself. But before you get there, you'll need to pass through yet more layers of scholars, rituals, and endless ink.
You shuffle onward, and the quiet whispers of the eunuchs give way to a different sound entirely. The scratch of brushes, the murmur of debate, and the occasional sharp sniff of disapproval. You've wandered into the domain of the scholar officials, those Confucian-trained men who run the empire with one hand on their teacups and the other on their scrolls. The room is lined with low tables scattered with brushes, inkstones, and folded robes. Scholars sit cross-legged or kneel stiffly, their long sleeves pooling like puddles on the floor. You perch nearby, half invisible, watching as they argue in the most polite way possible. Imagine the tone of two modern academics quibbling over footnotes, except now it's about whether a ritual bow should be at a 30-degree angle or 35. A mainstream fact to ground you. Scholar officials in the Ming Dynasty were products of the imperial examination system. They had clawed their way through endless hours of memorizing Confucian classics, passing one grueling exam after another, until finally, miraculously, they could sit here debating the allocation of rice tax. These are the men who kept the bureaucratic machine oiled, though perhaps not always efficiently. One scholar clears his throat and quotes a Confucian line about benevolence, which sounds noble enough, though you notice his neighbor rolling his eyes discreetly. Another fiddles with a brush, twirling it between his fingers like a fidget spinner. They all pretend to listen intently, but you get the sense some are daydreaming about dinner. It's reassuring. Bureaucratic meetings haven't changed much in 600 years. Here's the quirky tidbit. Officials often sprinkled powdered tea into their ink water to keep their brushes supple and fragrant. You picture your average office worker today accidentally dunking a tea bag into the printer, and somehow it feels just as absurd. You lean closer, and yes, that faint aroma of tea lingers in the ink strokes as the characters dry glossy and neat. Historians still argue whether the Confucian scholar class genuinely guided imperial policy or simply repeated well-worn doctrines while the eunuchs pulled the real strings. As you watch them nod and mumble, "Indeed," in practiced tones, you suspect the truth lies somewhere between noble ideals and sheer survival. After all, it's safer to praise benevolence in theory than to risk offending someone with real power. The debate continues. One man insists the rice shipments should be redirected to famine-stricken provinces, while another worries about angering tax-paying landlords. Their voices rise slightly, but only in the way that a breeze raises leaves, never too loud, never too brash. You imagine them in a heated argument, but the heat is tepid at best, like lukewarm soup. The tea, though, that's where the real passion lies. Silver pots circulate among the scholars, porcelain cups clink gently, and steam curls lazily. Each sip is followed by a moment of contemplation, as though enlightenment might emerge with the right brew. A few men even tap their fingers lightly on the table, an ancient gesture of thanks to the tea pourer. You can't help but smile. It's basically the polite version of a thumbs-up emoji. The air here feels both serious and soporific. You imagine nodding off while one official drones about the moral decay of farmers who failed to bow properly during harvest festivals. The scholar next to you quietly adjusts his hat, pulling it down just enough to hide the fact that his eyelids are drooping. Somewhere in the back, a young assistant busily copies down every word, his brush racing to keep up. Poor guy. He'll spend hours tonight reviewing smudged notes about how many strings of cash equal a sack of grain. His cramped fingers twitch slightly, as though begging for mercy. You almost want to hand him an ergonomic keyboard. Outside the chamber, faint sunlight filters through lattice windows, striping the floor with golden rectangles. Dust motes float lazily, adding an unintentional air of philosophy to the scene. You half expect someone to wax poetic about the dust of the ages settling upon the scrolls. Instead, one scholar sneezes loudly, startling everyone. The rhythm of this world is hypnotic. Brushstrokes, murmurs, sips of tea, sighs of resignation. It's the kind of atmosphere where decisions are technically made, but time seems to stand still. You feel yourself swaying, caught between the scent of tea ink and the gentle drone of Confucian aphorisms. Then, just as you think nothing will change, a scholar at the far end stands abruptly. He bows to the group, declares his disagreement in formal, flowery language, and storms out. Well, storms in the scholarly sense, meaning he walks slightly faster than usual. The others watch, eyebrows raised, then calmly resume their tea. Drama, Ming style. And as you drift toward the doorway, you realize this scene could repeat itself endlessly. Scholars debating, tea brewing, brushes scratching. It's not glamorous, but it's the steady heartbeat of the dynasty. And though you probably wouldn't survive memorizing all those Confucian texts, tonight you're just a drowsy observer, lulled by ink and steam.
You step out from the echo of scholarly voices and drift toward the warehouses where trade goods are stacked like puzzle pieces. The scent hits first. Silk that smells faintly of dye vats, porcelain that still carries the ghost of kiln smoke, spices that sneak into your nose with a tickle. You're in the middle of the Ming Dynasty's bustling trade machine, where objects speak as loudly as people. Row after row of bolts of silk shimmer in the dim light. They ripple like liquid when touched, their colors ranging from deep indigo to blinding scarlet. Imagine a rainbow, but organized and bundled by accountants with clipboards. You drag your fingers across one bolt and think, soft enough to make a pillow, but expensive enough that you'd never actually sleep on it. A mainstream fact to ground you. Ming China's silk was among the most prized exports on the global market. Through land caravans and sea routes, it found its way to Persia, Africa, and even Europe. The empire practically dressed half the world without leaving its borders. When you picture Renaissance nobles wrapped in shimmering brocades, chances are the threads were woven right here in these storerooms. Porcelain, too, sits stacked in crates, blue and white patterns curling across bowls and vases like tiny storms frozen mid-swish. You hold one carefully, too carefully, since you know if you dropped it, your entire Ming adventure would end in instant bankruptcy. A warehouse worker shrugs casually while handling 3 at once. To him, these are dinnerware. To you, they're museum pieces with "Do Not Touch" signs. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some porcelain vases were so large they could hold a small child. or a very lazy puppy. They weren't just decorative, they sometimes doubled as storage containers. You can almost picture one being used as a Ming-era laundry basket, though no official record would admit such indignity. Historians still argue whether Ming trade policies were open door or locked gate. On one hand, the dynasty allowed foreign merchants into designated coastal cities and oversaw vast maritime expeditions. On the other, it often restricted private trade and controlled exports tightly. To you, wandering among silk and porcelain, the answer feels like both, abundance and control in one breath. You move closer to a group of workers carefully wrapping porcelain in straw mats, their fingers quick, their rhythm practiced. Each bundle is loaded onto wooden carts bound for distant markets. The squeak of cartwheels mixes with the rustle of silk and the faint clink of pottery. It's a soundscape as steady as rainfall, oddly soothing if you let yourself listen. Then a scene that makes you smile. Two merchants squabble over a shipment of silk. Their argument escalates until one dramatically flaps a bolt of fabric at the other, sending a cloud of dust into the air. Neither wins, but the dust settles on both their hats, leaving them equally ridiculous. Bureaucracy belongs to scholars, but comedy belongs to warehouses. Nearby, spices and tea leaves wait in tightly sealed baskets. Open one and you're overwhelmed. Pepper sharp enough to sting your nose, cinnamon curling sweetly, tea smelling earthy and green. A dock worker sneezes, the sound echoing like a cannon, startling a row of chickens being herded past. That's right, livestock wander here too, because apparently commerce has no zoning laws. You lean against a crate and imagine the journey ahead. Camels trudging west with silk strapped to their humps, junks sailing south with porcelain swaying in their holds. The goods you see now will become the luxuries of another continent months from now. The global web of trade stretches outward, and you're standing at its beating heart. In the corner, a group of artisans paint porcelain with steady hands. Their brushes are finer than needles, each stroke as delicate as a spider's thread. One artist sneaks a glance at you, then chuckles softly when your eyes widen at his speed. To him, it's just another day. To you, it feels like watching magic. As you wander on, the light grows dimmer, filtering through small, high windows. Dust motes float in golden beams, settling on silk, porcelain, and spice alike. The workers keep moving, their rhythm undisturbed, their patience endless. You realize this is the unglamorous engine of empire, not thrones or temples, but warehouses filled with fabrics, bowls, and spices, quietly making their way to the world. And with each step, you feel heavier, lulled by the creak of carts and the whisper of silk. The Ming capital may roar with voices outside, but here it hums with objects, each one carrying a story across oceans. You drift along, just another shadow between crates, almost forgetting you're not supposed to touch that vase.
The warehouses fade behind you, and now you find yourself outside a sprawling examination compound. It looks less like a school and more like a prison. Row after row of narrow cubicles, each just big enough for one person to sit, write, and slowly lose their sanity. The imperial examination is underway, and you're about to step into the minds of 1,000 anxious scholars. The compound buzzes with nervous energy. Men shuffle in with baskets of bedding, food, and ink, each looking like they've aged 5 years in the walk from the gate to their assigned booth. Guards check supplies to make sure no one sneaks in cheat sheets. You imagine trying to slip in a modern study guide and immediately getting caught. Because, let's face it, a glowing paperback would look suspicious here. A mainstream fact. The Ming Dynasty civil service exams were notoriously grueling, often lasting several days. Candidates were locked into tiny cubicles where they had to compose essays on Confucian classics, demonstrate poetic skill, and solve policy questions. Success meant a career as an official. Failure meant going home with nothing but cramped fingers and bruised pride. You peer into a cubicle.
The scholar inside sits on a wooden plank no wider than a park bench. His bedding is rolled up in the corner, his inkstone balanced precariously beside a jar of water. He dips his brush, sighs deeply, and begins scratching out lines of text, pausing every so often to mutter passages he memorized as a child. You feel a pang of sympathy. He's not just writing, he's gambling his entire future on brushstrokes. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some candidates grew so desperate that they wrote their essays in minuscule characters on their robes or even tattooed answers on their skin. One story claims a scholar inked formulas onto his fam, pretending it was decoration. Of course, if he was caught, it was game over. You glance at a nearby cubicle and swear you see someone glancing a little too often at his sleeve. Historians still argue whether these exams created a true meritocracy or simply rewarded those wealthy enough to study for years without farming or laboring. As you drift along the rows, the mix is clear. Some scholars wear threadbare robes, others gleam in finer cloth. Everyone sweats the same, though, under the relentless pressure. The air smells of ink, sweat, and faintly sour rations. Candidates gnaw on dried buns, sip lukewarm water, and occasionally groan quietly. A guard walks past, stone-faced, making sure no one sneaks in cheat sheets. You imagine trying to slip in a modern study guide and immediately getting caught because, let's face it, a glowing paperback would look suspicious here. One scholar leans his head against the wall, eyes half closed, muttering lines of Confucius. You imagine him drifting off mid-essay, brush still in hand, only to wake with a blot of ink across his sleeve. Another taps his brush against the inkstone nervously, creating a steady, maddening beat. It's a symphony of anxiety, and you're seated in the front row. The ordeal drags on for days. Each candidate is allowed only short breaks for meals or brief rest, all within their cubicle. You glance at the bedding rolled in the corner and try to imagine curling up in such a space. You'd last maybe 20 minutes before pleading for Netflix and a pillow. Outside, families gather at the gates waiting for news. Mothers whisper prayers, fathers pace, siblings bring extra food parcels. For them, one scholar's success could raise the whole family status. Failure, however, is just as communal, disappointment rippling outwards like a stone in a pond. Inside again, you notice one scholar carefully rolling his essay into neat sections, his brushwork precise, his posture calm. He looks like he's been preparing his whole life for this moment. Another, 2 rows down, looks ready to burst into tears over a question about agricultural policy. You quietly cheer for them both, knowing that history will only remember the names of a few who pass. By nightfall, lanterns flicker across the compound, casting yellow light onto pale, strained faces. The scholars write on, determined, exhausted, half dreaming. The sound of brushes never truly stops. It rises and falls like waves, lulling you into a drowsy rhythm. And as you step back from the rows of cubicles, you can't help but marvel. This is the furnace where officials are forged, the crucible of ink and sweat that sustains an empire. You, though, are only a visitor, and you're already ready for a nap.